Well, my clock says that it is actual 4 o'clock now, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Marty Pritikin. I am the Dean of Concord Law School. Has been alluded to in the last couple of sessions, the first online law school. We have a couple of current and former Concord folks here with us in the room. We've got Greg Brandis, Scott Burnham, Steve Burnett. Thank you for coming. Most of this won't be new to you, but maybe some of it will. So the reason why I wanted to give this presentation is because prior to joining Concord a year ago, I spent 12 years at a brick-and-mortar ABA law school. And I tried to do curricular reform there, and then I tried to do curricular reform at Concord, and there were some similarities and there were some real differences. And so I thought it would be helpful to hear from someone who had this perspective to talk about some of those differences without necessarily throwing my former institution under the bus, to talk about what I think were some of the advantages of doing curricular reform in a fully online setting, as well as some of the challenges. So for those of you who may not be that familiar with Concord, I want to give some brief background on it to provide some context. So Concord was founded in 1998, almost 20 years ago. Its mission has always been to make a high-quality education affordable and accessible. Tuition's now about $12,000 a year, compared to the average of ABA schools, about $45,000. It is 100% online, and because of that, it is not accredited by the ABA. It cannot be by the ABA's rules. It is in the registered unaccredited category with the State Bar of California. On that basis, our JD grads can sit for the California bar exam after graduating. We have a 4-year part-time JD program. We also have a 3-year part-time executive Juris Doctor, or EJD program, which is not designed to lead to bar licensure. We used to have accreditation through the Distance Education Accreditation Council, and now we are accredited by the Higher Learning Commission through Kaplan University, of which we are a part. And you may have heard the news that Kaplan is being acquired by Purdue, which is itself accredited by the Higher Learning Commission. I don't know what our name will be once that transaction goes through. It might be Concord at blank, or it might be something else. Who knows? Now, even though we are fully online, we don't purely rely on adjuncts. We do have our own faculty, full-time faculty. Significantly, though, they are not tenured. They are full-time, but they are not tenured. And even though they're not tenured, virtually everyone who's there has been there for at least 15 years, nearly since the beginning. So it's not like just because we don't have tenure, we have a bunch of turnover. Most of our faculty helped create the institution. And we also have the benefit of working with Kaplan University's Curriculum and Innovation Department, so technologists and curriculum specialists who generally work with the rest of Kaplan University and only recently have started working with Concord on the law side. Now, our student is not the typical ABA student. Our average student age is 43 years old. They've been out of school for 20 years, and so people are often choosing to go to a fully online school because they are the breadwinners for their family, they've got child care responsibilities, geographically they're not near a brick-and-mortar school, and they don't want to have to move or quit their jobs to go to law school. So if they don't go online, they don't go. The majority are female, almost half are minority, and interestingly, even though California's is the only bar exam they can sit for after graduation, almost 2/3 reside outside of California. Some are willing to move to California, some don't want to practice law, or some want to leverage their California bar license in the state they're in, either through in-house counsel or federal court practice or something else. Now, one thing that our students do generally have in common is they are insanely busy. We know from LESI data that our students are studying 25 to 35 hours a week on top of an average of 45 hours a week of work and childcare and other similar responsibilities. So they're basically going 70 to 80 hours a week, almost 52 weeks a year for 4 straight years. It is an incredible burden. Now, some of this, our structure is dictated to us by the California State Bar, and if we were to obtain California State Accreditation, which Greg mentioned in an earlier presentation, may be coming down the pipe with the California State Bar, that may give us some more flexibility in how we can structure our program. Now, in terms of an overview briefly of our pre-existing curriculum, our JD program is 92 units. 82 of those are in required courses, so our JD students don't have a lot of flexibility to take electives. All the California bar tested subjects and MBE tested subjects are required. They have a first-year skills class. They have upper division writing and research classes, professional responsibility, sort of the things you would expect to see in a standard law school. We also have a course called Future of Law Practice to expose them to the technological, sociological, economic changes that are affecting the practice of law, as well as a capstone course, which is really, frankly, a bar preparation course. We also offer a variety of electives, skills electives, subject matter specialty electives. We do have externships that students can take either in person or remotely. And we even have a competitive moot court team, which has done pretty well against brick and mortar schools. The last competition we went to, we beat out schools like UCLA and Berkeley to win Best Brief. So trying to hold our own in that regard. So in terms of what our pre-existing curriculum was, and if pre-existing curriculum sounds like pre-existing condition, maybe that's not totally accidental. As Greg alluded to, when Concord was founded, it was innovative by virtue of the fact that it existed, right? But it had some technological limitations based on the fact that it was 1998, 1999. Dial-up was the prevalent mode of delivery of education. And distance learning education, technology's come a long way. And there hadn't really been a significant revision of the curriculum since Concord started. And since then, some other online schools have popped up. Obviously, ABA schools have started to move at least into the hybrid online space. And so when I came in, I thought that there needed to be some updating. So the readings, there were traditional case books. There would often be a horn book assigned in addition. Greg had mentioned in his presentation that we would give reading quizzes where we would assess them on the readings we assigned them. But the way it's been is that those reading quizzes only were in the first-year courses. After the first year, we assume they know how to read, we know how to absorb the material, and so we don't keep assessing them on that. Our videos, we would have recorded asynchronous video presentations, which would typically be hour-long talking head presentations of a law professor in front of a background of law books talking about the law. And we know that that's not necessarily the ideal way to present substantive material. We would have some interim essays. Live seminars would be once, maybe twice a week. They'd last about 90 minutes, so as not to overload people with too much synchronous content given their schedules. And there would be occasional discussion boards or other practical exercises. And then, of course, the final exam, which would generally be a combination of traditional issue spotter and multiple choice to prepare them for bar-type assessments. So I wanted to revise our curriculum. And Kaplan University, as I mentioned, has a curriculum department. They already have some curriculum principles. They sort of have 5 pillars. First is motivation, right? Adult learners need to know why they should learn this, how it fits into something they care about, whether it's their professional goals or otherwise, right? Contextualization. We know that what sets apart an expert learner from a novice learner is that they have a context in which they can sort and fit new information. So for new law students, we want to provide that context. And then iterative learning, prepare, practice, perform, right? Giving students multiple opportunities to get exposed to material, to practice applying the material before we actually get to the point where we assess them in high-stakes assessments. So when I spearheaded this revision project, there were certain key principles based on my background with trying to do curriculum revision at my prior school, as well as learning about adult education and distance learning education, right? So there's now research on this, which there wasn't 20 years ago. But we wanted to integrate this with adult learning research because, as I said, since our typical student is in their 40s and has often been out of school for 20 years, they may not learn exactly the same way a 22-year-old fresh from college did, right? At the same time, we wanted to try and integrate the best practices in legal education, legal pedagogy from the Carnegie Report or otherwise, and try and marry these things. So one important thing is we needed to make better use of student time. We know our students are busy. They probably can barely afford to put in the time they're putting. So we couldn't cram more content in by just saying, well, they're going to study 40 hours a week instead. It's not going to happen. If anything, we got to try and pare down the amount of time they're spending, but make really good use of it. Try and be as efficient as possible with that time, and that effectively means more active learning as opposed to passive learning, and more interactive learning. One practical impact of that, which made some faculty nervous, was if we want them to have more application, that may mean cutting some reading, right? Because better to have them really get what we're teaching them, but teach a little bit less, than teach them everything under the sun, but we don't have enough time for that to sink in. Also, important that they do something with the readings. I know from my old school, if you give students something to read and you don't make them do something with it, they think it was a waste of time. So if we're going to ask students to read something, we want to do something with it, whether it's a quiz or a practical exercise based on it or something. We also, of course, wanted to integrate bar prep into our curriculum earlier and more consistently than we already had. Concord, like every law school, needs to keep its bar numbers up. That's a critical indicator for regulators, for the marketplace, and for the good of our students, of course. And so we wanted to try and fuse it with that. The old model was essentially to really wait until the fourth year, their final year, to really focus on bar-related material, and I didn't want to wait for that. One practical thing we've done, and I'll get to that later, but we wanted to integrate practical exercises and exposure to practice-related documents. Right? Experiential learning, of course, has been the buzzword for a number of years, and although there are some challenges to doing experiential learning in an online setting, we knew it was important to try as much as we could. Spaced repetition, as I mentioned, iterative learning, and the idea that we should figure out what's most important for students to know, both in terms of substance and skills, and expose them to that intentionally, periodically, so that by the time they get to fourth year, it hasn't been 3 years since they've been exposed to those first-year foundational law concepts. It was also very important to coordinate across our curriculum, across courses, both in terms of scheduling, so that we try and stagger assignments to smooth out the workload for students, and also in terms of content. Can we find synergies between what you're covering in your torts class and your contracts class, or between your substantive class and your skills class? And this was particularly important to me because in my prior school, this is one of the biggest challenges we had in curriculum revision, was getting faculty to coordinate. Jack talked during his presentation just prior to this about some of the challenges of the tenure system and some of the ABA and ALS regulations. So one of the things I found was, like anything else in life, there was sort of a bell curve. There were some people who were very eager to coordinate, some people who were kind of lukewarm, and some people who dug in their heels. And the problem was that the people who dug in their heels were dispersed enough amongst the curriculum that it was hard to coordinate anything because they were embedded in the first-year courses, the second-year courses, the third-year courses, and so on. And if you couldn't get buy-in from everyone, well, you couldn't really make it happen. Well, fortunately for me, and one of the reasons why I left an ABA school to come to Concord is because since there's not tenure and there's not guaranteed job life security, I can make it somewhat of a benevolent dictatorship. And I could say, guess what, guys? We're doing curriculum reform, and we're going to coordinate. And people said, great. But more than that, it wasn't that I had to twist people's arms. The culture was different. People were already receptive to coordinating before I ever got there because they had a different mindset about what curriculum should be. Okay, so what was the process? Well, in terms of the initial stages, to a large extent, it was the same as what you would expect to see in, or expect to hope to see, in a traditional law school setting, at least if they're following basic principles of assessment, which the ABA is now starting to require, and which has become sort of in vogue in the recent years. So the first thing we did is we said, what are the program competencies that we want our students to learn by the time they're done with their 4 years, right? And we came up with 7 as a faculty, which are probably not much different from what you would see at any traditional ABA law school. Then we moved to course level outcomes. So in each course, what are the 3, 5, 7 things we want a student to know or be able to do by the time they're done with this course? And you'll see here that over on the right, there's these numbered references to application, synthesis, and so on. So we assign them a rating based on Bloom's taxonomy, right, of lower order learning and higher order learning. And then what we did, the next logical step, is we mapped it. Right? We created a grid that maps your program outcomes to all your courses and your course level outcomes to see which course level outcomes further the ball for which program level outcomes, and then you could look on one big sheet and say, where are we deficient? Where are we weighted too heavily? Where could we try and beef up this outcome, and which course or courses would be the most logical place to do that? Once we did that, then we went to course level planning for each course. So, of course, the first basic step would be, what are the topics I want to cover in this course, and in what sequence do I want to do that? So we looked at what the prior sequencing was, and then we talked about what we would want to do to change that, and what would be the pros and cons of approaching it in a different order. Then we would do course level assessment mapping. So for every course level outcome, there has to be an assessment where that outcome is measured according to a rubric. And the key here is that that is independent of what their grade on that assignment is. You get a grade for an essay, let's say, but if we're assessing your ability to IRAC through that essay, you'll get a different assessment score based on that. And then again, we chart that out. Now, what I think was really important, as I mentioned, was the cross-course coordination. So what we did once we did this, or sort of in tandem as we were doing this with these course level planning, was we looked at, okay, what does it look like across the first year? And then what does it look like across the second year? And so on, right? And so one of the things we could do is we could say, hey, I was thinking about doing a big interim assessment in Module 11 in my course. Well, I was going to do one in Module 11. Okay, well, how important is it to you that yours be in Module 11? Could you move yours up to Module 10 and it still works for you? And we would kind of negotiate, like I said, to try and stagger it so students aren't overwhelmed, and also to build up, right? Because it may be that early on the essay should be worth less, and we don't expect as much of students in terms of their level of performance as later on in the semester, later on in the year. So we coordinated about that. And then again, to the extent that we could see any substantive or skills coordination, we would note that as well. Now, one other layer that I tried to add onto this was I wanted us to not just eyeball it, but think specifically about what are the skills that we could infuse in these classes, what are the spaced repetition opportunities, what are opportunities to expose them to ethical issues, right? Because we know the Carnegie Report talks about professional identity and weaving together substance and skills and ethics, right? And what practical documents or exercises could we expose them to? So this first column, skills, we actually got together at a faculty retreat and brainstormed about what are all the skills we want students to have. Hard skills, soft skills, right? And then we talked about where within the curriculum could we naturally infuse those things. So sort of like a second order curricular map, not so much focused on content or program level outcomes, but these other skills and these practical assessments that we wanted them to have exposure to. We also made a number of significant structural changes as a result of these faculty-wide discussions about how we might want to change our curriculum. For example, we used to have our upper division legal research and writing courses in our third year for historical reasons which recently haven't really been as applicable. And so we got together and said, hey, people have wanted to move this to the second year for a long time. We're already monkeying up everything. Here's our chance to do it. Right? It's kind of like when you redo your bathroom, it's like, well, they're knocking down a wall, let's redo the kitchen too, and the next thing you know, you're redoing the whole house, right? In our upper division writing course, it's a 2-semester course. It used to be the same for everyone, and now we're doing it where the first semester is uniform for everyone, and the second semester, people can branch off into a litigation track or a regulatory transactional track. Not that different from what some traditional law schools are doing, but of course, with us, because we're building it online, you can't just change it on the fly. When you're building this for years to come. So it requires more advanced planning, but it can also benefit from more advanced planning. We reorganized the sequencing of our 3L courses to create more room for students to build in more robust electives and externships in their third year, rather than having to wait till their fourth year. That Future of Law Practice course that I mentioned before, what we used to do is students could basically prepare a presentation on any subject of their choosing related to the course, and then they would deliver that presentation orally to the class as a final project. Well, because we decided that business and strategic planning was a critical skill we wanted all our students to have, we decided not to give students so much flexibility and write about anything they wanted. We decided your presentation is going to have to be a business plan or a strategic plan. So we know that every student will have that by the time they graduate. We expanded our fourth year capstone course, which is a bar prep course, from the last 3 months of the fourth year to span over the entire fourth year, a year-long course. And part of this, again, was in recognition of the fact that our students are busy and they need more time because they can't cram for 80 hours a week for the bar the way students in brick-and-mortar schools might be able to. We also struck an arrangement with Kaplan Bar Review, which is a sister company of ours, to integrate their material into our bar prep curriculum, as well as give our students steeply discounted prices on Kaplan's commercial bar prep to try and remove costs from being a barrier to all our students taking a commercial bar prep program. And the other big change we made was that Community property was a required course, so it was tested on the bar. It was 4 units, 2 semesters in the first 2 units in the first semester of 4th year, 2 units in the second semester of 4th year. And what we did is we said that second semester of community property, which doesn't really warrant 4 units of substantive law, we're converting to a family law practice course, sort of like applied community property. Now, part of that is we wanted to have a practical capstone course, and we thought family law was a good subject to do that because we know there's a great need for it. In New York, 90% of family law litigants are self-represented. In California, it's over 80%. And frankly, for a new law grad who's trying to get their feet wet, that's the kind of cases that come your way, right? Families come out of the woodwork, family members, they say, hey, I got this custody issue, I'm divorcing my spouse. They also come to you saying, draft my will, that sort of thing, right? And so we wanted to give them some practical exposure to something that would help them and would also be something that society needs. And then we have reworked our curriculum to ensure that there will be 15 units of experiential learning throughout the required curriculum. We know that the 15-unit number is something the ABA's kicked around. They're not there yet. California's kicked it around, New York. And so we're kind of in this limbo where we're regulated by the state bar, but we're not accredited. We hope to have state bar accreditation. I don't know if ABA accreditation is ever in the cards, but we kind of want to be able to satisfy everyone. And so we said, let's just go to the highest common denominator, and let's just have 15 units required and be done with it. So that's what we're doing. Other omnibus changes that we've made. So I mentioned those reading quizzes that were only in the 1L. Well, now we call them resource quizzes because they encompass videos as well. They're in all courses throughout all 4 years. So again, making good use of the student's time, saying we're not going to ask you to read something unless we think it's important enough to assess you on. And at the same time, it sort of holds them accountable because they are being assessed on it. So they got to take the reading seriously and they can't just blow it off. In addition to those resource quizzes that appear in every module, right, we also have, for spaced repetition, cumulative quizzes every 5 modules that incorporate whatever came in the last 5 modules, and the next one can be whatever's in the last 10 modules, and so on. We also only occasionally used discussion boards previously, and now we have discussion boards in every module of every course. The idea is to create more of a learning community, as was referenced before, and the idea being that it can't all be professor and student, right? The students are going to have more robust interaction if they're interaction with each other. I mentioned before we wanted to have earlier exposure to bar prep material, so since there's obviously lots of multiple choice and lots of issue spotter essays throughout, the one feature where that hadn't been the case was performance tests. And I like performance tests because they do double duty. They expose students to what they're going to see in the bar exam, and they're in the context of a practice type exercise that new lawyers are likely to encounter. So now students are going to start getting exposure to performance tests in their 2L year. We didn't do 1L because they got enough fish to fry, but by 2L they've made it past that first year hurdle. Now they're ready to start going. One other big thing is we wanted self-assessment to be emphasized from the beginning of their first year and throughout. Now, this is important not just because, well, professors don't have time to assess everything, so they got to assess it themselves, right? We all know, anyone who's involved on a faculty level of legal education knows that there's been changes in the last decade or so where students don't feel as invested in being responsible for their own learning. They have more of an expectation that the faculty are supposed to just provide learning for them and make it happen. And we need to actively combat that and explain to students that not only will you learn better if you can learn to self-assess, but self-assessment is one of those critical soft skills that practicing lawyers need, right? You need to know, when is this brief good enough to turn into the partner? When is it polished enough that I feel comfortable filing with the court? And that's something that has to start from day one. Okay, so that's a high-level overview of the curriculum. This, of course, was a massive project management undertaking. It's basically a 2-year project, which we're about halfway through. In terms of the timelines, we assumed that it would take about 10 to 15 hours to build one module's worth of content between the videos, the quizzes, everything else, right? And so, assuming a pace of a module a week, that when we worked out what was feasible for people to handle, we figured about 3 to 4 weeks of planning before that module build, and then for a year-long course, that's 30 weeks of content, plus 2 months tacked on at the end for review, and any last-minute editing. And so that basically means you're talking about almost a year to build a year-long course. And so we had this production timeline, which actually we've already blown. It says it ends in January of 2018. It's probably going to end in June of 2018, but for good reason. And we did it in 3 phases because we have a fairly small faculty. We have about 500 to 600 students. At the time, we had about 8 or 9 full-time faculty. And with all the other responsibilities, we still were going to need a few adjuncts to round things out, because we were talking about revising the equivalent of 18-year-long courses. That's a big undertaking. So when you got 9 faculty and 18-year-long courses, and it takes, 8 months to a year to revise a course, that's why the project's taking 2 years, because they basically can do about 1 at a time. We had to try and stagger it based on people's subject matter expertise, as well as when the different courses came in the different phases. So some people weren't getting slammed with 2 courses at once, and other people didn't have anything to do for a while. So that was definitely a project management undertaking. And as you can imagine, for full-time faculty, we needed to offer course relief. There was no way to expect them to teach their full load of courses and do this curriculum revision. Now, Concord faculty are not expected to publish. Some do, but it's not an expectation like it is at traditional schools. And so we couldn't say, well, we don't expect you to publish this year. That doesn't really help them much. We had to give them some course relief. And for part-time faculty, adjuncts who were asked to take on revisions, then for them we had to offer financial stipends. So that was also something we had to manage in terms of the balance of course load and stipends. But still, at the end of the day, a relatively manageable financial undertaking to completely revamp your entire required curriculum over the course of a couple of years. Now, a lot of other production management issues, so time tracking. We're trying to abide by the 45 units per credit, the Carnegie unit, 15 hours active, 30 hours inactive or out of class. This was also a big issue we wrestled with at the California State Bar, because they know how to track classroom hours for brick and mortar schools. How do you track classroom hours for a purely online school? So we had to negotiate this definition of what counts as an in-class hour. We needed to make sure we satisfy that. And again, because we want to make sure we're making good use of students' time, we need to make sure that not only do we meet the minimums for the regulators, but we don't go too far over so that we're overwhelming our students who are going to be doing 40, 50 hours a week. So we kept a very close eye on the hours. We also had a grade book where everything had to roll up to 1,000 points, so it would be easy to calculate, easy for students to follow as they go. Document management has also been a big undertaking for us, because in each module there might be a dozen files, 15 modules per semester. That could be a couple of hundred files per course per semester, 18 courses year long. You're talking about literally thousands of files. So we use Google Drive, a shared drive, to track and share all these documents. That itself, just keeping track of how to keep track of it, has been an undertaking. Lots of different folders for each course, each semester, each module, and subfolders and subfolders and subfolders. That's been a big deal. So as you can imagine, all of this required faculty training. Yes, we were the first online school, but as I said, no one had gone through revisions like this since the beginning, and the technology has changed. And even though our faculty are online professors, they're not necessarily tech gurus. I'm not necessarily a tech guru. And so they needed help. So first thing was, I needed to get buy-in from my faculty about those high-level curriculum principles that I talked about earlier in terms of spaced repetition and practice and things like that. Then they had to learn about the process of course mapping and developing course outcomes. Some weren't even familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, so we had to get them up to speed on that. Then there was the nuts and bolts. They weren't necessarily familiar with how to take advantage of Google Drive. I'll be honest, there are features of Google Drive I don't love. It's not the most user-friendly, but the fact that files can be shared and you don't have to keep track of multiple iterations of documents, and people can be all over the country, which our faculty are, editing the document at the same time, it makes it worth it. Also, Google Docs, which is their version of Microsoft Word, and Google Slides, which is their version of PowerPoint. People weren't necessarily familiar with those, even assuming they were familiar with PowerPoint. And some of our faculty weren't that familiar with PowerPoint either. So we had to get them some basic training just on that. And then, of course, recording the videos required familiarity with screencasting software, which some of them hadn't done in almost 20 years, if ever. So a lot of faculty training going on, no small feat. Okay, so what happened after all this work? What does it look like, right? So obviously I can't go into all the features, but I'll try and go into some key features. So one thing is readings. One thing we did was we try to get rid of casebooks to the extent that we could. We try to have all the readings in one spot to make it more convenient for our students, to save a few $100 a year. If there's anybody from West, maybe they don't want to hear this. But we try to do that, and so we tried, just as an example, sorry. So basically, we got permission from Thomson Reuters to download cases from them, and as long as we give them attribution that it was downloaded from them, we would basically do our own HTML interactive cases. This one I picked, it's not a great one because it doesn't have a lot of interactivity, but you can obviously insert your preliminary note from your professor, and then there's rollover bars where if you want to define a term or have a hyperlink to a statute or a case that's cited, you can do it. If you want to delete those hyperlinks so that they're not going off on tangents and just focusing on the case, you can do that as well. Because what we realized was we're assigning them these case books, but we're not necessarily assigning them the notes and questions between the cases, or if we are assigning them that, we're not doing anything with it. And so if that's the added value the case books bring, but we really just want the cases, let's just do the cases. So that's one of the things that we did. Also videos. Let's get back here. So here's just one example of a video that I cut for Wilson Trust.
We will discuss bars to succession that may prevent someone from inheriting, even though they were otherwise in a position to take, share, during life. Let's start by framing the problem of slayers with a basic illustration. You've got husband and you've got wife. So far, so good. Wife, however, is fed up with asking husband not to leave the toilet seat up one too many times, and so she pulls out a gun and shoots him, killing him. Now, husband is the decedent, and let's assume he dies intestate and without any issue.
All right, so just one little example, right? But you can see, instead of the talking head behind in front of the background of books, we use PowerPoint. We try and make it visually engaging, try and use some humor if we can. We use diagrams to illustrate the legal doctrines, since so many laws are susceptible to visual representation, and they're much shorter, right? So 15 minutes is about the average, maybe 20 minutes, and then we assess them immediately after each video to reinforce and apply what they just learned. Now, when I did a hybrid flipped class in my brick and mortar school, I made PowerPoints and then I just talked and screencasted them. But this time, we did scripts. And let me tell you, some faculty were not that happy about it. They said, I don't do scripts. And I said, I don't do scripts either, but we're going to do scripts. And even though there was some resistance on the part of some faculty, here's an example of a script with the PowerPoints on the right. At the end of the day, most people came around and say that it made them better for it because you're forced to think selectively about what you want to say, what's too much, what's not enough, right? As I think Daniel Webster is attributed saying, if you want me to speak for an hour, I need to prep for 5 minutes. If you want me to speak for 5 minutes, I got to prep for an hour, right? And so since we want it to be efficient, good use of student time, professors have to put some more work in the front end. Of course, one nice tool that helped with this is the voice typing tool in Google Docs. So for my professors who said, I can't type very fast. Yes, you have it too. You go in Tools and Google Docs, and there's voice typing, and you just speak into it. Now, one thing I'll say is, for legal jargon, it's not so great. Every time I typed in, I said mens rea, I thought it was like mens rayon suits, but, so that you'll have to tweak. But it certainly saves a lot of time and a lot of carpal tunnel syndrome. As I mentioned, we'd have the post-video learning activities after every video, and there's a variety of different formats that these could take. On a basic level, you can do multiple choice, right? And so, just a basic thing, you ask a question, they submit their answer, and then they immediately get feedback, and you can do different feedback depending on what their answer is if you want, or you could have the same feedback for everyone. You could have it where students have to get a certain number right in order to move to the next thing, or not. Lots of different ways to structure that. Sorry for the jumping back and forth here. We also wanted to have something more than just multiple choice formats. So for example, we could do term matching. just to give students more practice with the black letter law and definitions. So here's one example of this. Basis for imposing probability for failure to act. That sounds like, what is this? I don't know. I'll just guess. I'm wrong. Okay. And it can show me the right answer, or it cannot. I go to the next question, and here's legislative history, and so on and so forth, right? And there's actually different, once the professor supplies the information, you can plug it into different formats. You can even do like a Jeopardy type format to try and make it engaging for students, to try and make that drudgery of learning the black letter law a little more fun and engaging. Another example is categorizing, right? Students often have to put things in different buckets, so we could literally have them put things in different buckets, right? So you can do drag and drop. Recklessness is a mental state, correct. I see that voluntary assumption is a mental state. That's incorrect. I have to try again, and I put it somewhere else, and I get it right, and so on, right? So we thought about what are all the skills involved in learning the law, whether it's basically all the steps of IRACing, right? You got to know the law, you got to be able to spot the issue, apply the law, and so we tried to break it down granularly. So rather than just jumping straight to essay writing, you could have an intermediate issue spotting exercise, right? So let's be a little temperamental here. That's no fun. All right, well, not working, so we're going to keep on cooking. But basically the idea is you can have exercises where rather than just say write the whole essay answer, write your statement of what the issue would be. And then you submit it and you compare it immediately to the expert answer, and you can even have the expert answer have rollover boxes or a note about it explaining, well, in case you thought this, here's why that wasn't right, so you kind of anticipate what common student issues might be, right? Because since most of the curriculum is asynchronous, you want, to the extent possible, to try and simulate that coaching that a professor would give, even though they're not there, right? And obviously, they're free to email the professor and ask questions. Professors are happy to set up phone conferences or even video conferences for students who want more follow-up help. But of course, if you can head as much of that as possible off at the pass, then students are getting as close as possible to the benefit of professor mentoring in an asynchronous format. Outlining, obviously an important skill. Hopefully this one will work. Oh, nothing's cooperating today. Well, then you know what? I'm going to go to my backup, which I did just in case the interactive stuff wasn't working, which I feared it might not. So here are some still examples. Here's more visually engaging videos, the video scripts I talked about. Multiple choice activities, the term matching, categorizing. Here's issue spotting. Here's an example of what I was talking about. You can compare your answer to the expert answer side by side, and there could be a note regarding the expert answer. Outlining, right? Getting students to focus specifically on the skill of understanding the hierarchy of relationships between concepts. Is it A, B, and C, or is it A subpart 1, subpart 2? That's important for students to know, right? Also, slapping a bunch of terms out there isn't the same as understanding how they fit in relation to each other. So you could do multiple choice outlining, you can do drag and drop outlining, all sorts of different things. Obviously, they can practice doing essay writing in a no-stakes or low-stakes environment before they get assessed on a high-stakes essay. And there's also practice-related exercises as well, or you can do process stuff. I did a couple of things in my criminal law class I drafted where they would go on Westlaw and look up jury instructions. And then they would apply those jury instructions to fact patterns that I gave them. And then they would see sort of expert answers of that. This is something early on in torts, right, to sort of give them the procedural context of a torts case, and all the different steps. And you could click on a complaint, and then again, it'll ask you some question after reviewing the complaint. What do you think the cause of action were? Or what facts were important to establish this element of this cause of action, whatever the case may be. And then even aside from the post-video activities, we really want to take advantage of the interactivity of the technology, right? So for example, course outlines, right? So for each module, we could have an outline where, and they can click on the arrow and it'll show them sort of the next level of the outline so they can understand that contextualization we talked about, understand how what they're learning fits into the broader whole so they can see it visually and keep track of it better. So those are some examples of ways we try to take advantage of the technology. And then, of course, I mentioned the resource quizzes and the module quizzes. This is very straightforward to do on the learning management system. You give the questions, they submit them, and then they get feedback. As I mentioned, most off-the-rack platforms, even setting aside proprietary platforms, have multiple options you can use about how to structure these things. Do they get the feedback right away or not until they submitted all of them? Do they get a second chance at answering before it gets graded, or do they get one attempt at it? If they don't get a certain score, do they have to take the quiz again until they get a certain score? All sorts of different ways that you can choose to structure it in order to serve your pedagogical goals. Then, of course, we have interim essays, we have final essays. We'll typically have a model answer, and we'll typically ask them to do, or not all the time, but we will have them do self-assessment. Sometimes their self-assessments are graded, because we want to make sure they're taking self-assessment seriously. So we'll grade the first one, now grade your own. We'll grade the next one, now grade your own, right? And we'll grade them on their grading, so to speak, so that they're learning that skill in addition to being graded on the essay itself. And all this is the asynchronous part, right? So in brick and mortar schools, we talk about flipped classrooms, and the only live part is the classroom. So for us, that's our live seminars. And Greg, in his presentation, showed a screenshot from one of his classes from a while back with Concord. I've showed just a couple of screenshots. These happen not to have the video of the professor because they wanted to focus on whatever the PowerPoint is. But as he mentioned, and I blocked it out because I was paranoid about FERPA, so I blocked out everyone's names. That's why I didn't show a live clip of one of our live sessions, because I didn't want to have to get permission from everybody involved. But you can see the participants. They can chat via the chat box, or they can do the raise your hand function if they want to broadcast their audio. There's the whiteboard, and the whiteboard can be interactive where you can draw on it. This happens to be a skills class. Here's a doctrinal class where they're using a photo to try and provide context to the factual background for the courses. And so for us, one of our challenges now is, how do we flip our online classroom? Meaning, now that we've baked all this stuff into the asynchronous portion, right? What is the way to make the best use of the time they spend in the live classes, right? So is it problem solving? Is it role playing as trial lawyers, right? I'm doing evidence in addition to criminal law, and so in addition to sort of standard issue spotters, I'm having them draft an opposition to a motion in limine pretty early on, and then they're going to draft a motion in limine later on. They're going to do oral argument on a motion to suppress, right? So in addition to hundreds of one-off problems, we're taking a civil case and a criminal case, and we're revisiting those cases again and again throughout the semester, so that they can, throughout the year, so they can see how evidence gets applied in a more sophisticated manner, the way trial lawyers actually use it. And I know other professors are trying to do practice-related content in their other classes. So in corporations, they're going to draft articles of incorporation. And in civil procedure, obviously, they're going to draft complaint, answer discovery. None of that is that novel, right? But the challenge, of course, is how do we do that in the asynchronous setting? Well, it turns out, if you're drafting documents, asynchronous is easy, right? That's really no different than what happens in brick and mortar schools, except that you're clicking upload instead of handing in the piece of paper, which frankly in brick and mortar schools you're clicking upload anyway, right? Or you're sending it via email. The bigger challenge is to the extent that we want to simulate negotiations or oral argument or things like that. How do you do that in a structured way remotely? If it's a small class, then 8 people or an 8-person skills class, then doing it via video conferencing or the LMS, pretty easy to do. If you've got a bigger class, you either have to break it up across multiple class sessions, or, for example, we have an oral advocacy class where people will record themselves and submit their recordings to the professor for grading and feedback. So that was a lot in a very short period of time. For some takeaways, and then I'm happy to discuss or take questions, I realize that you may be thinking, I'm not going to revise 18-year-long classes, and there's no way my faculty is ever going to go for that. Okay, we probably bit off more than most people would want to chew, or maybe that we should have chewed. It doesn't need to be massive, right? If you could get coordination even on just your first-year classes, that would be fantastic. right? Or if you could get coordination on just 2 of your first-year classes. Just say, hey, my Civ Pro professors and my Torch professors, they're on board. Contracts, he's out in left field. He doesn't want to get involved. Fine. We'll leave him out in the cold. But we're going to link up Torch and Civ Pro, and we're going to follow a Torch problem throughout Civ Pro. Great, right? And I know Jack alluded to the challenges in ABA schools of integrating online learning in the first year, but okay, fine. Let's do what we can. In the upper division, how can we integrate technology, right? Because not only are you overcoming some of the barriers that are inherent in distance learning, but as was mentioned before, dealing with technology is itself an important skill. We all know, right, that the ABA has said you have to maintain reasonable familiarity with technology to practice effectively and responsibly, right? But in addition to that, if your students aren't comfortable or familiar with video conferencing technology, that's going to make it harder for them if they want to represent clients remotely, right? And we know that from society's perspective, society's better off if the legal profession taps into unbundled legal services, limited scope representation, right? What can I do for you that doesn't involve me representing you from nuts to bolts the whole case? Oh, I can write this brief for you. I can advise you about how to self-represent in court, how to fill out this court form. You don't need to be in the same location as your client to do that. And if you can get on that as a lawyer, then you can have a leg up in getting clients, in getting business, right? So that itself is helpful for students to know. I will say that whether you're going to go big or you're going to go small, faculty coordination is essential. If you don't have buy-in from faculty, it makes it much harder. And if you are in an ABA setting where your full-time faculty mostly have tenure, and some of them may be open to it, some of them may be resistant, you don't have a lot of leverage you can pull with those who are resistant. There's not that many sticks, there's just carrots, right? So finances are tight these days, so offering financial rewards for people for doing this type of work is maybe not so easy, but maybe you offer some course relief, and the people who are really passionate about it, they'll volunteer even if there's nothing in it for them. And you do what you can. Faculty education is also essential. As I showed, there's a lot of steps in terms of familiarity with curriculum principles, familiarity with project management, familiarity with course mapping, with outcome development, rubric development, even the technology involved in document management, timekeeping, and recording, and PowerPoint development. There's a lot of different things that faculty may need help with. If you don't have that help in-house, get it. There are tech specialists out there, there are curriculum specialists out there. They're happy to help, and rather than bang your head against the wall and try and reinvent the wheel, rely on people who have that expertise. And really take advantage of what the technology can do. If I'm being honest, I don't think we went as far as I would have liked to go when I first imagined this in terms of being even more interactive, but you got to be real, right? Faculty have limits, they have time constraints, they have conceptual constraints, students have limits. You can't do everything. I'd like to think we went pretty far in pushing the envelope in infusing these revised principles throughout most of our curriculum. And I think what we've shown is that so-called flipped classroom principles apply in a fully online setting as well. Because as Greg mentioned in his presentation, most learning is asynchronous already anyway, even in traditional classrooms. And so other than that live class where the question is how well can a distance learning live session approximate or even exceed what goes on in an in-person live setting, it's all asynchronous. And the reality is technology can do things that you can't do in person. When I'm in my classroom and I discuss a multiple choice question, I can't give individualized feedback to each student. I don't have the time. You can do that with technology. I can't necessarily give immediate feedback to each student about each problem. You can do that with technology, right? And so we're fortunate that the technology has come so far and the industry has come so far that there's a lot of infrastructure in place. You don't have to be a tech guru. You don't have to be a curriculum guru. There's off-the-shelf packages or things that can be easily modified. Law professors know the law. They know teaching. And they just need to marry that with the technology. And if they are willing to be open and explore it, they can really take their teaching farther than they ever could just relying on the traditional tools of a sage on the stage. And my last point I would say is, just like in any other program, you should continually reassess and adjust, right? There was talk about frequent student evaluation to make sure that you're on the right track in the last presentation. Any good system of assessment measures, reflects, and changes in light of what you found. And that applies to online learning as much as anything else. So I guess my parting words, and I'm happy to take questions, is try it. Try it out. Push the envelope. Baby steps are fine. Do whatever you can. But it's so good for your students. It's good for your faculty. They may not think it's good for them, but most of them will thank you. I'll never say all of them. Most of them will thank you because most faculty do care about student learning. That is their top priority. And the reality is technology can help student learning. And if it can, why not embrace it? That's all I have, and I'm happy to take questions or comments. Yes, yeah.
More of a comment. I'm struck by, as I said, one of the areas where I teach is what I call digital lawyering, whether it's 21st century law practice and the use of process and technology generally. I also teach a little course in expert systems to show students how to automate a automated process. And one of the things I tell them is you need to recognize that in terms of efficient delivery of legal services, the bar is inhibiting your ability to do better.
Yep.
In effect, LegalZoom has an advantage over you because LegalZoom can get outside investment. LegalZoom can approach that market, the middle class, in ways you can't.
Right.
You're restricted as a lawyer. Seems a little bizarre, but that's one of the reasons LegalZoom is doing so. So as I listen to you, I'm hearing, this is amazing what you pulled off. I don't think you could do it in an ABA law school because I don't think you can get them. I don't think you can find a faculty at any ABA law school that will move that quickly to rethink its curriculum and move to asynchronous. So by being, to some degree, outside of the regulatory process, which we might think, oh, you're disadvantaged. Your students can only take the bar in California. To some degree, you had an advantage.
So I agree with that and appreciate the kudos, although we're not out of the woods yet. We're in the middle of the process.
No, I'm
But I think you're right. I mean, that's why I was saying baby steps, right? Because I don't think you're going to get this much change this fast in an ABA school. But to even show that it's possible, people say, well, if I could do 5% of that, 10% of that, that could be a big change for a school. And we should encourage people to take that on. But I absolutely agree with the regulatory issues. It's a double-edged sword. Obviously, I'd love to have ABA accreditation, right? I think that we're $12,000 a year. I think students would be banging down our door if we were ABA accredited, but ain't going to happen anytime soon. So you take the good with the bad. Yeah.
I had a quick question just about when you were talking about faculty training, as far as like the Bloom's taxonomy and just principles of educational development and design. Did you bring somebody else in for that, or how did you do that training?
So the Kaplan University, they have a curriculum innovation department, and one of their positions there is called an assistant dean of curriculum. Okay. And so they came in and they gave through Google Hangout a video conference presentation using PowerPoint to explain those things to them. And then people would submit draft documents, and they would give feedback on the documents, say, well, this isn't really in line with curriculum principles and that sort of thing.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, about regulatory destruction. How do the ABA rules on online education affect the way you develop the courses? So they've been working on these rules for online education for a while. I don't even know what the current state of them is. But I'm just wondering if how you were working under that shadow and how you think they work right now with their rules. Because that's something that's a real challenge for people developing it is, you don't know in the future whether the ABA will accept that.
So, right, the current ABA rules is basically you're not supposed to really do online learning the first year, and then after the first year up to 15 units, but the definition of a distance learning unit is if more than 1/3 of the instruction is online. So basically, if you skate under that 1/3 limit, then you could have 1/3 of all your classes be online after the first year, and then 15 of those could actually be fully online, right? So it does make it a challenge. I think number one, I think the ABA is not likely anytime soon to become more restrictive with online learning. If anything, it'll become more permissive. So I think schools should feel comfortable trying to push it to the limit. And I will say, not that I would frequently disclose private conversations I've had with Barry Currier, who's a former dean of Concord. Now he's the managing director of the section of legal education bar admission for the ABA. But in talking about this, he said, I don't know why more ABA schools aren't seeking variances. We'd be open to it, but they're not banging down our door. Now, I don't know what he's telling the schools, or I don't know what other people are telling the schools, but that's what he said to me. And so at least from my limited base of knowledge, the ABA in theory would be receptive to it. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment, I kind of disagree with your statement about not being able to do this in ABA schools, and the example is William Mitchell. They completely coordinated faculty and recreated a JD program online in the new curriculum for it. So it can be done in an ABA setting. It has to have the right faculty mentality to do it, and I think that's what happened at Mitchell, is they had a faculty who was willing, the most important thing is willing to cooperate and coordinate curriculum from the get-go.
Right, and the big question is, if you don't already have a faculty that's receptive to that, your ability to do something about it is fairly limited because of tenure.
Yeah, and you're right, that's a great example of William Mitchell. I talked to the dean when they were going through that process, and I think part of the reason they were successful is they did it with their part-time program. They were able to say, we can't get the whole faculty to buy in. And my understanding is much of the faculty did not agree with the program, but they found enough to get critical mass to make it go. So I think you're right. If you've got enough faculty and you can take a distinct part of your program and say, we're going to go online with it, that works. The dean, I think he was named Chicago Loyola,
David Yellen?
Yeah, David Yellen managed, my understanding is he launched it before stepping down. Chicago Loyola has taken the 1/3, and they've got a part-time night program without a variance. That is a weekend JD program on the model of a weekend MBA program. So, but again, I've talked to the person who's doing contracts in that, the small cadre, within the faculty that was willing to do it. So I agree, you can pull it off.
Cadre is enough to pull off a JD program. You can do it. That's all I'm saying. It can be done.
Yes.
Takes
You
management
mentioned
by the dean.
doing the flipped classroom synchronously. Are you doing that at Concord? And if so, what do you use for conferencing?
Well, for our live seminars?
I'm talking about flipping the classroom and having oral presentations.
Right, so the oral presentations, for my evidence class, yeah, so we have our online platform. It's called Indigo. It's a proprietary platform. We're actually going to be transitioning into a different platform, and so for the time being, we think we're still going to use Indigo. We might consider a different platform like Adobe Connect, we're not sure. But yeah, I mean, basically, if you're not trying to have 20 people talk at once, if it's a small number of people making presentations or one person making presentation, the online learning management system works just fine.
Setting, you'd have to have at least 2 people making the presentation.
If it's
You'd have to have a judge.
yes, right. So I'd be the judge, and say, okay, this student, you're going to be prosecutor for the next 5 minutes. You're going to be defense lawyer.
Right.
Go. Yeah, and you just do it.
And they're in different parts of the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
There were some other hands up. Did you, Peter, have a question?
Actually did. We're not from a regulatory, ABA, political, accreditation, all those points of view, but from a teaching and learning perspective, what are the biggest challenges you're facing right now? And can you talk about some of the things that either didn't work or didn't work as well as you had hoped?
Well, that's a great question. I would say one of our biggest challenges is, for us, I think, is striking the right balance in our writing classes about how much feedback to give. Because if we give a lot of feedback, they don't read it. And if we don't give enough feedback, then they say, you're not giving me the support I need to learn, right? And so that kind of ties in this bigger issue of our students are busy, right? And so trying to figure out what's that sweet spot, right? I mean, you can only go so much tailoring it to each individual student. Find that sweet spot between how much do we give them or how much do we ask them to do so that we're really giving them that rigorous training, but we're not overwhelming them. That, I think, for us is the biggest challenge. But that may be in large part because our student population is unique, right? I mean,
the typical student at an ABA school is in their mid-20s, and they have maybe 10 hours a week of outside commitments, not 45 on average. So it's a different challenge set for us. Yes?
Slightly related, when you're, nuts and bolts, but when you're calculating the amount of hours per class for outside time, what are you setting for discussion board time? Of course, it's always a trap what every class is doing. You must put some general number, or does it change per class?
So our discussion boards, unless there's like a really distinctive assignment, we sort of have, I don't want to say generic prompts, but prompts